I'm about welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're on to this section, which is for Genesis, right? It is amazingly legal. And so we're getting into some of the more legal side of things in terms of Judaism and how Judaism looks at these commandments and sees them as a way in which to forge a relationship with the divine. That in fact there's something very, very deep about this concept of being commanded by a higher power. So we have these laws, as it were, that are understood to refer to humanity. And we'll go on to, we just were analyzing a law involving the consumption of animals, of flesh, and some details involving that. And now we're going to go on to something else. Since eating meat involves taking a life, that subject is going to continue here. So we're going to go on to here. We're actually right there, I believe. Let's see. Yeah, definitely. The again, a however, right? In other words, despite the fact that one is permitted to consume meat and take the life of an animal, there are limitations to this, right? So here we are. However, et dimchem lenafshotechem, your blood for your souls, Edrosh, I will search out. In other words, I will hold you accountable. So essentially, we're talking about taking the life of a human being now. Miyad kol chaya edroshenu, from every animal, I will search it out. I will require it. Umiyad ha'adam, and at the action on an action of a man, of a human being, Miyad ish echad, ish achiv, from one, a man and his brother, right? Or a man against his brother. Edrosh et nefesh hadam. I will search out. God is saying that he will hold accountable, right? He will hold accountable the taking of a human life. That is something that is taboo. It is forbidden. So, and that's why we have this ach at the beginning, the limitation. And we'll take a look at what he has to say here. V'ach et dimchem v'gomer, right? However, your blood, ben Noach. So it turns out that a non-Jew, ben Noach, descendant of Noach, neherag b'dayan echad, he can face capital punishment at the hands of one judge. Jewish courts, in terms of capital cases, required, let me think, I'm trying to think of exactly how many, I believe it was 33, something like that. You required a large number of judges for is it 23? I'm going to say 23 judges were required for a capital case, as I recollect, 23. But in the case of a non-Israelite, their courts can take on capital cases with one judge. Uve'ed echad, and likewise, a single witness is permissible to convict someone of a capital offense. This is just according to according to Torah law. Shelo ba'atra'ah, even if this person is not forewarned. Hatra'ah is the concept of, in order to determine that a case is in fact a capital case, the person who's perpetrating the crime has to do it fully conscious that what they're doing is a capital offense. And so two people had to say to this individual, do you realize that what you're doing is a capital offense? And that person had to be able to say back, yes, I'm fully aware that this is a capital offense and I'm still going to do it. That's the concept of hatra'ah. Mipi ish velo mipi isha. However, what's interesting is that there is a limitation, at least here according to Torah law, that, in other words, at the testimony of a man and not at a testimony of a woman. Va'afilu karov, and I believe here it's saying even a relative may. So there's a limitation there in terms of a man as opposed to a woman bringing testimony. Afilu karov means a relative, and here it means that even a relative may testify against someone for a capital case. And obviously, in Jewish law, we do not accept the testimony of a relative in order to convict someone of a capital offense. So how come? How do we have all these things? The Amarkra, because scripture cites the ach et dimchem, because it says, however, your blood, lenafshotechem, according to your souls, right, idrosh, I will require. So it means because it is singular, afilu b'dayan echad. From that we can infer that only one judge is required here. And we see the little footnote there, so we'll take a look at it, right? Yitachen, it would appear, the samich lidroshchen, that he is relying on this particular interpretation, alashon edrosh, because of this terminology of I will require, which is singular, lashon yachid, that's singular. And that's why in this particular context, a single judge is sufficient to determine a capital offense. Miyad kol chayai, and going on to say, at the hand of any wild beast or any animal, afilu shelo b'hatra'ah. So consequently, obviously, you can't forewarn a beast, an animal, that what they're about to do is going to render them killed, right? That it's a, quote, capital offense. And because it says that, we realize that in general, because you can't do that with animals, the whole concept of hatra'ah is inapplicable. Idrashenu, I will require it, umiyad ha'adam, afilu be'edechad, right? So, and at the hands of a man, that means a man, which is in the singulars, so afilu be'edechad, meaning that one witness is sufficient to condemn someone of a capital offense. Miyad ish, miyad lo miyad isha, and because it says at the hands of an ish, let's make sure it says that, right? Let's see, are we gone? Forgive me, it's on this page. Miyad ish, there it goes on to say a hand, right, a man, and from a man. Right, ish, there's the ish there. So velo isha, and so that means, and not from at the hands of a woman. A woman cannot testify in this case. Achiv, and it says achiv, his brother, afilu karov. So if it's his brother, obviously he's a direct relative. So we show the support and the basis for all these inferences regarding a capital case with and of a non-Jew. Going on. The Ein, he says, and check out, he says, look at Vide, look, the Rambam, Maimonides, and this is the Maimonides code where of his Mishneh Torah, Perik Bet, chapter 2, Halacha Gimel, the fifth halacha, the fifth law, Mirotzech, his chapter called Murder, a murderer. Katav, this is what he wrote, V'zeh l'shono, and he's going to quote, V'zeh l'shono. We don't have quotation marks in Hebrew, at least in older Hebrew. So the way in which we know someone's quoting directly is this abbreviation, which means V'zeh l'shono, and this is his language. Shofech dam ha'adam, he says in analyzing this particular verse, right? One who spills the blood of a man, ze hahoreg ba'atzmo. This is someone who kills by himself. I believe that's what we mean, that he himself is the one who has committed the murder. That refers to a murderer. Et dimchem, going on and pulling this verse apart, lenafshotechem, your blood according to your lives, according to your souls. Ze hareg et atzmo. So it says, damchem lenafshotechem means he's understanding this to mean your personal blood, and that is referring to suicide. Suicide is also forbidden the way the Rambam is interpreting this verse. Miyad kol chaya et ashena, from every beast I will require it. Ze hamoser chaveiro lifnei chaya letarfo. This refers to a case of someone who pushes someone in front of a wild animal so that it'll kill him. Right? So you're pushing him. You yourself aren't actually committing the murder, but you're putting him in a situation where he is going to get killed. That also, in this case, miyad ha'adam miyad ish achiv. Remember, it went on to say, at the hand of a person, at the hand of a man, his fellow. Ze hasocher acherim. This refers to a case of someone who hires others laharog et chavero, to kill his neighbor. In other words, a paid killer. That is also a capital offense. Uve perush ne'emar b'shlosham, and in specifically it says regarding these three situations. Lashon Drisha, it uses the terminology of require, searching out. Hare dinam masur l'shamayim. So in this case, he says these particular situations are ultimately relegated to heaven, right? That heaven is the one who is going to make the determination of this person's guilt or innocence. Ad kan, meaning end of quote, up to here. So that's what the Rambam says. Kesef Mishneh. So one of the major commentaries on the Maimonides Mishneh Torah, Yad Chazakah, right, his great code of Jewish law. Kesef Mishneh is one of the major commentaries. Lo her'a makor lidvarim elu. He doesn't show any source for Maimonides' statement here. In other words, it has much more authority. Maimonides, as much of an authority as he is much more authoritative if he's quoting one of the earlier rabbis, like somewhere in the Talmud or in the Mishnah or something like that. And there's the Kesef Mishneh, who's, by the way, you should know that when you read Maimonides' code, it's written in beautiful, beautiful Hebrew, and he sets things out. He is so incredibly such a genius. He is able to set out essentially all this Jewish law in a very straightforward kind of way, which is like it takes a special gift to be able to do that. However, what makes Maimonides' code of law difficult is he doesn't cite his sources. He doesn't say in his code where he got this material. And the Kesef Mishneh, one of the basic jobs of the Kesef Mishneh is to show the sources of Maimonides' law, which of course is another brilliant, absolutely brilliant level of scholarship. That Kesef Mishneh is so familiar with the length and breadth of rabbinic material that he's able to do sort of a Jeopardy game with Maimonides and show where this came from, where his laws came from. And he's saying that in this case, he did not show a source. He does not show a source for Maimonides' statements here. Vehem b'midrash rabbah, and it turns out it's not a halachic work per se, but it's also an early rabbinic work. There are those who say that the Midrash Rabbah is actually the Agadata, meaning the theological as opposed to legal material from the Jerusalem Talmud. That's essentially, you don't find very much what is called Agadic material in the Jerusalem Talmud. You do find plenty of Agadic material in the Babylonian Talmud, and this has to do with allegories and statements more in terms of that one could call theological as opposed to legal. So here we are in the Midrash Rabbah, Perek Bereshit, in the chapter on Genesis, Perek Lamed Dalet, in chapter 34 in the Midrash Rabbah. That's definitely a rabbinic source. Utumi Hani, and I am surprised, the Torah Temimah is saying, Shebekidushin Mem Gimel, that in the Tractate Kiddushin, page 43a, Chakru Tuva, they they go into a very, very major exploration, right? Be'inyan ha'oseh shaliach, regarding the one who makes, in other words, who asks someone else, who makes a emissary, an agent, laharog et chavero, to kill his neighbor. So in Kiddushin they're discussing one of the categories that Maimonides mentions, right? That one who hires someone to kill someone else is also guilty of a capital offense. Im Chayav HaMishalech, in this discussion, there is a question there. They question if the one who basically commissions someone else to kill someone else, or hashaliach, right? Whether or not the one who commissions or the one who is commissioned, right? Um, Mishum, and the reason why is there's a principle, en shaliach devar avera, that in principle, I cannot make you an agent of mine to commit a sin. That that is not something that is under my jurisdiction. That even if I ask you to commit a sin, you are going to be held accountable if you choose to do that. You cannot really say, because when you make someone an agent, basically you're putting them in your place, right? And I cannot make, as a Jew, I cannot ask someone else to commit a sin on my behalf. That is simply not something that is legally something that I can do. And if I ask someone else to commit a sin on my behalf, that person is fully responsible for having committed the sin. And the basic argument is, you know, divrei harav, divrei hatalmid mishomin. The words of a teacher, the words of the master, the words of the student. Who do you listen to? In other words, the master, of course, is God, and I'm the student, and so consequently, if I ask you to do something that it contravenes what God has commanded, it has no legal sanction to it at all. So that's a discussion they discuss in this particular, the issue of one who asks someone else to commit a murder on their behalf.
But
Velo, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, question?
doesn't that go back to part days, like a shot, like if you know God said something, but then that's the literal version, and we're not supposed to take it literally.
No, no, I don't think that's the issue. We're talking here about halacha. We're talking, you know, there's other material besides legal material in the Torah. There's narrative, there's prophecy, etc. So there's other material that lends itself to metaphoric meaning. I'm not saying that you can't find metaphor within law, but ultimately you have to take the law as it stands and as we understand it. Law itself isn't on the basis of metaphor, even though we might be able to find metaphoric application. But thou shalt not murder is thou shalt not murder, period. Even if we want to say, well, it means other kinds of murder.
But I mean, what did God say? It wasn't only the Ten Commandments, right? I mean, it
Correct.
was
Right, but one of the
everything.
one of the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not murder.
But there's a lot of other things that he said were that are considered very extreme legally, right? Now these days.
That may well be true. That may well be true. And there are certain situations where we have to apply the oral law, okay, and the way in which one is able to derive oral law from written law. But that's essentially that's not pardes. That's nothing to do with pardes. That has to do, I don't believe so, I could be wrong, but I believe that Pardes has more to do with areas that lend themselves to metaphor as opposed to legal stuff. There are there are in fact rules by which one may derive laws that are not explicitly mentioned in the Torah. They are the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael. So, for example, there's, going from a minor premise to a major premise that is considered, a legitimate way of deriving biblical law. Okay, so I mean, if you're, if you're making the point that, even if it's not explicitly stated, is it still considered biblical law? Yes, if it can be derived in this particular way. But murder
No,
is murder.
I'm making the point that if we say God said something,
Yes.
but it would result in an extreme punishment, what we consider extreme punishments, then are we still to do it? Or
No, we're not in a position to do that. That has to do with circumstances. They are, as you can see, even from what we're reading, there are certain safeguards to prevent the possibility of executing someone, you know, and executing them without having had all the information you need. And possibly, there are people who are executed and later on they find out that they were actually innocent. And we want to be very, very careful about that because we can't, once we've taken a life, we can't give it back. So, but it's a little bit here. Here we're still on this particular issue here, and that's this whole thing where Torah Temimah is citing a Rambam, and he analyzes this verse, and he's saying he doesn't understand why the Kesef Mishneh didn't give a source for what the Rambam said you know, having dealing with what we're dealing with now and the fact that he's finding other sources that the Kesef Mishneh would have been familiar with. So let me keep going. So, just have a few more lines to go, but let me see what I can do with this, okay? Velo hiviu klal, right? They didn't and again, this is in the discussion in Kiddushin, I believe he said Kiddushin, right? Where they're discussing the issue of one who hires someone else to kill for them, to murder for them. Velo heviu klal. They didn't bring at all drasha zo. They didn't bring this drush that we've got, right? That we just mentioned. They don't mention this particular source. V'af ki yesh lechalek, and despite the fact that one can distinguish bein hasocher, between someone who pays someone to do this, uvein haoseh shaliach, and one who simply appoints an agent bidvarim, with words. In other words, there's a difference. One can sort of say there's a difference between a situation where I pay you to do this and where I simply commission you to do it, but without paying you, where I simply am asking you to do this. That's an issue to discuss with regards to punishments that are associated with this act. Bidvarim ba'alma, simply with words. Ukamosha katavti la'el, and he says this is in the similar sense as I wrote above, the Parsha Bereshit. We're on Parsha Noach right now, and that's the earlier Parsha of Genesis. But pasuk in the verse that says "Velo ubo," where where Eve says to the serpent, when the serpent asks Eve about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he says, well, you can eat from all of them, right? And she says, no, I can't eat from this tree. And in fact, we can't even touch the tree. And of course, they were not told they couldn't touch the tree. And the serpent uses the argument later on. Later on, God does not ask the serpent how he could do such a thing because the serpent had a defense. And the defense would be, again, precisely a similar kind of argument, which says, well, you told them not to eat from it. I told them they could eat from them. That's exactly what the serpent does, right? Tells Eve, you can eat from it. You see, you can eat it. And Eve went ahead and ate. And the serpent's defense is, divrei harav, divrei hatalmid, the words of the master, which would be God, right? And the words of the student, which would be the serpent at this case. Who do you listen to? right? So, in other words, the serpent basically saying, you can't really hold me accountable for what Eve did. You can't say because of what she did, you're in trouble now. You can punish me maybe for having said that, contradicted what you said, but you can't hold me responsible for Eve's behavior. So that's why he's referring to that here, right? B'chol zeh, nevertheless, lo hava leil ashtamute milahavi klal. In other words, and I think he's saying the Kesef Mishneh had no right to completely reject, right? To completely leave out milahavi klal v'chlal drashazo, to bring out. So maybe he could have, maybe the Kesef Mishneh could have left out some of the other stuff that we're mentioning, but there's no way, right? This particular drush explicitly talks about a situation of someone who basically commissions someone else to commit murder. Ulai, and the only reason he says mipnei she'ein lemedim halacha, that you do not actually learn halacha, you do not learn Jewish legal, right, Jewish law, min hamidrash, from the midrash. But tzarich, and he says this requires further investigation. So again, we've had, we have this Torah Temimah himself is just, these people are so knowledgeable in terms of the length and breadth of Jewish tradition and Jewish learning. And I mean, there's an ocean of information out there, and these people are familiar with it. They know their way around. And here he can, he's familiar with the Rambam, which is pretty much primary. He's familiar with the Kesef Mishneh, which I can tell you is a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult to study and learn, etc. He's familiar with that, and he's also familiar with Midrash Rabbah. He's familiar with Kiddushin, where these particular subjects are mentioned. And here he is putting it together for us and expressing some surprise that the Kesef Mishneh does not give us any source for this Maimonides quote that we had. So I realize that this is somewhat technical, but nevertheless, I hope it was clear enough for you as to what we did today. And I'm going to mark the page, make sure I have it, and also mark where we are. See what I can do so I know where we go next time. Okay, let's make sure I don't want to. I believe yes, right. Okay, so we will be, next time we meet, this will be what we'll be discussing. Excuse me. And that's what we'll look at next time. I'm going to stop the share here. Thanks. Okay. Any thoughts, any comments? Just tell me, is this just too tough? Is it too convoluted, or you feel relatively comfortable with what we're doing here?
No, I was figuring about there's a way of getting around the sin, but I don't know if it's true or not. When I go into a shul and it's dark, and the maintenance man is there, I say, "Oh, it's dark in here," and all of a sudden his brain says he goes and turns on the light. Now, did I sin?
Of course, we're assuming the maintenance man isn't Jewish, right?
Correct.
Right. So yes, they are technical in that particular circumstance. They're trying to avoid asking him to turn on the light, right?
Right.
So there is a beautiful, in Tractate Shabbat, there is a discussion as to whether or not a Jew can benefit on Shabbat from a non-Jew who does something that is forbidden for the Jew to do on Shabbat. There's actually a Mishnah, which is, of course, earlier than the Gemara. And of course, there is a discussion in the Gemara about it. But the Mishnah tries to delineate situations where, essentially the way it works is, if the non-Jew is doing it for themselves, since non-Jews are not commanded to observe the Sabbath, right? If the non-Jew is essentially doing it for themselves, a Jew can benefit. But there are all kinds of shading on this. So, for example, if the Jew is a very close friend of the non-Jew, and you can't really be sure whether the non-Jew was doing it for themselves or for the Jew, it may not be permissible. Okay, so all kinds of different situations there.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's it's an interesting area of law. But you're right, Harlan. You're very, it's very astute of you to make a connection between asking someone to do something that is not permissible. I mean, in general, obviously, if you're not allowed to do it, you can't ask someone else to do it for you, right? You can't
Right.
ask someone else to rob a bank for you. Okay.
Right.
Can't do that.
Correct.
But in the case of the Sabbath, it's more complicated because you are not allowed to do it, but the non-Jewish person is allowed to do it. And that creates an interesting sort of mix there. But with that, I am going to end today's lesson. Okay. So,
Rabbi,
yeah, go ahead. You're
what is
still
the ocean?
recording. I'm
What is
sorry.
the ocean? What is that ocean of text that you're referring to?
Oh, I'm
You said
just talking about the amount of Talmud, the amount of learning, not only in the Talmud itself, which is volumes and volumes of information, but also, I mean, there's a whole bunch of rabbinic material that is extant. The Mishnah, these Midrashim he's referring to, there's just tons and tons. And then there's all the work that was done in all the centuries that followed. So, I mean, we're looking at the Torah Temimah, which also, I mean, it's a major effort to get through Torah Temimah and to be able to remember what he says and to be able to study it. And so that's when I talk about the ocean. There's a reference to the ocean of Talmud because there's so much to explore. And just like with the ocean, you see the surface, right? You see the surface area, right? Especially here in California, you can look out at that Pacific Ocean, that magnificent thing, and all the things that are buried and hidden underneath the surface of that ocean. And likewise, all the amazing things and treasures, spiritual treasures that are to be found in all this material. So I think that's why we use that metaphor. So.